Joining me now is Bishop William Barber. He's president and senior lecturer of repairers of the breach. Great to have you with us here this afternoon. Let me ask you first of all about the depth of that divide. How deep has it gotten? How hard is it going to be to get out of that?
Well, I don't know if I agree totally that Trump has exacerbated. I think what we've seen for a long period of time, we've seen an extremist group that has hijacked the Republican Party and has been engaging in a lot of racialized policies. You know, we have to not just talk about racism in terms of personal relationship. You're talking about, we've seen the worst form of voter suppression since 2010. When you look at the attack on health care and the disparate way that hurts African Americans, you look at the way in which immigrants are being attacked, that's racist. You look at what's happening at Standing Rock and Oak Flats in Arizona, those are racist attacks on our Native American community. What Trump has done has gone loud with it. The people, what has happened is not just him. That's what we have to keep saying. He has been enabled by extremists, senators and congresspersons who have chosen greed and lies and racism and xenophobia as their foreplay, as their forte, as opposed to our deepest religious values of love and justice and mercy and grace, or our constitutional values of establishment of justice, domestic tranquility. That's what has gone on. And what has happened is Trump has just gone, you know, viral, if you will, with it. But if you notice, most of the Congress people, they don't disagree with his agenda, they disagree with his antics. And so I have, when people say, is someone a racist, and they say, well, I'm against Charlottesville, most of them are against Charlottesville. But let me ask you where they stood on voting rights. McConnell and Ryan have held up fixing the Voting Rights Act for over 4 years. Over 4 years. We have less voting rights today than we had August 6, 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was first passed. That's systemic racism. The refusal to pass living wages is systemic racism, but it also hurts large numbers of whites. In fact, in raw numbers, the policies of Trump and the extremists hurt more white people in raw numbers than do black people, but they frame their issues, they get elected through racialized voter suppression. Yeah. That is the challenge of how we have to begin to talk in this country and help people understand that racism is not just against black people, it's against democracy itself.
Reverend Barber, a lot of people got to know you from the speech that you delivered at the Democratic National Convention last year. I know of you from growing up in North Carolina, but at the end of that speech you quoted from a hymn, "Revive Us Again." Where is that revival coming from? As we sit here in 2017, looking ahead to 2018, where is that revival coming from?
Well, I can tell you that people all over the country are moving up. I have decided to, and been asked to join the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, with my co-chair, Reverend Dr. Liz Steele Harris. We've gone to 15 states in the last few months. We've seen thousands of people ready to sign up for a sustained period of civil disobedience, direct action, public education, and voter registration. I'm talking black, I'm talking white, I'm talking young, I'm talking old, I'm talking gay, I'm talking straight, Jew, Muslims, Christian. People are saying this must be a season of resistance, not just to an individual. We're talking about moving in 25 states and the District of Columbia. We're talking about being in the Congress and in state houses and challenging the issue of systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, and this distorted moral narrative that is promoted by Christian nationalism that says so little about racism and injustice and so much about personal issues like where people's sexuality is, which are the things that the scriptures and our deepest moral religious values talk the least about. So I feel people are coming together, and it's not new, David. What people have said, this is not new. Woodrow Wilson did some of the same things that Trump is doing. Warren, the next candidate after him, William Harding, some of the same things. Ronald Reagan, Nixon. What has had to happen, though, in every age is people have had to be willing to stand up and resist. That is why with this court situation now, we're exposing what's happening with Barr. This Trump, it's not just Trump, the senators have approved him to be nominated, a man who is a racist, a man who has ties to an organization that was committed to Nazi-type views. How does that happen? That's not just Trump, that's the senators. And what we're trying to show people is this man is against voting rights, he's pro-voter suppression, and when people can get elected through voter suppression, we don't have the Voting Rights Act to do pre-clearance, so the courts is our only recourse.
Yeah, and
when the courts are undermined. Go ahead.
That's Thomas Alvin Farr, and I wanted to ask you just on that note, I was looking at the News and Observer earlier this week, and there was an astonishing piece there by a political science professor from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill writing about what the voting landscape looks like in North Carolina. Let me just read a little bit from his piece. If it were a nation state, North Carolina would rank right in the middle of the global league table, a deeply flawed, partly free democracy that's only slightly ahead of the failed democracies that constitute much of the developing world. He continues, North Carolina is not only the worst state in the USA for unfair distracting, but the worst entity in the world ever analyzed by the Electoral Integrity Project, districting rather than distracting. Let me ask you sort of what your prescription is there in North Carolina, where you live, how you plan to target that. What is there a systemic problem in North Carolina, that the way that these districts are made?
Well, remember that the Tomorrow Monday movement, the NAACP in North Carolina, we beat these laws. Number one, we just won. It took us 6 years to overturn racialized redistricting. So next year we'll have new districts that have been drawn by a special monitor. We also overturned the voting rights voter suppression law, a monster voter suppression law. It took us 4 years, but we won. The Supreme Court called it surgical racism. But here's the thing. If the Voting Rights Act had been in place and we had had pre-clearance, the law would have never gone on the book. It went on the book because Tom Tillis and others passed it after the Voting Rights Act had been gutted. So we had to go to the courts. It took years to fight through the courts. We fought Tom Farr for 6 years and beat him. We should have never had to go to the courts. Now that we have new districts, we can begin to change the state. But this is happening, brother, all over the country. That's what is so ugly about these appointments that Trumpism is trying to put in place, but they're trying to hijack the judiciary. Here's the last thing I would say on that. The Americans need to know that when you allow people to get elected by racialized voter suppression, guess what? It's not just about black people. The people who get elected by racialized voter suppression are also anti-labor rights, anti-workers' rights, anti-living wages, anti-poverty programs, anti-civil rights, anti-women's rights, anti-public education, anti-immigration reform, anti-health care. And here is the ugly irony. More white people, particularly in the South, get hurt by those who get elected because of racialized voter suppression. At the very time that if 30% of African Americans that are unregistered get registered and we connect with progressive whites and connect with brown people in the South, we can have more Alabamas. Remember, that's what extremists were scared of during the Obama era. It was not so much Obama, it was that his candidacy brought a victory in Florida, Virginia, and North Carolina, southern states. We changed the South, we changed the country. We're going to build a poor people's campaign, a national call for moral revival to begin to do just that.
Reverend, great to speak with you here. Happy New Year as well. That's Reverend William Barber joining us today from Raleigh, North Carolina.